The dust had barely settled after the noon sun scorched the muddy main street of Dry Hollow when the crowd started to gather around the wooden platform. Auctions weren't rare in the town. Horses, rifles, land, even busted-up wagons went under the hammer. But today was different. Today they were selling a woman. She stood barefoot, wrapped in a torn shawl, her face hidden beneath layers of dry, cracked mud. Her wrists were bound in leather, and she didn't utter a word. No tears, no screams, just silence. And that silence crawled under the skin of every man in the crowd. Barker Reese, the auctioneer, slapped his hand against the post. Fresh from the mountains, wild thing found near the Elk River. Don't talk much yet. Who'll start me off at $20? Whispers rippled. Some laughed, others frowned. One man spit on the ground. But in the back, leaning against a support beam, Elias Boone watched. A tall, broad man with shoulders like cut timber and a gaze sharp as a hatchet. He didn't care for auctions, but something about this felt wrong and familiar. 25, shouted a voice. 30. 45. Elias stepped forward before he could stop himself. 70. A hush fell. Eyes turned. No one raised the bid again, not against Elias Boone. Reese slammed the gavel. Sold! As he approached, Elias noticed her chest rising slow and steady, like she didn't fear a damn thing. Up close, the mud on her face looked more like a shield than filth. She didn't move until he reached out and untied her bindings. The leather slid free and her arms dropped like they were dead weight. She looked up. Her eyes, pale green, shimmering like the inside of a creekstone, met his. Then her lips parted. Her voice was cracked but clear. "Dalka," she whispered. Elias froze. The world narrowed around that name. Dalka. The name rattled in his bones like distant thunder. He hadn't heard it in years, not since the massacre up in the Bitterroots, not since he'd stumbled out of a forest soaked in blood, breathless and broken, while the others vanished without a trace. She could have said anything else, anything but not that name. He blinked as if trying to wake himself, but she was still there, still staring. And she knew. Before we unravel the secrets hidden behind that cursed name and the chilling silence of the woman who bore it, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next in this tale of blood, snow, and shadows in the pines. Elias didn't say a word as he led her to his horse. Behind them, the townsfolk whispered. And in the distance, the clouds began to gather over the mountains, thick and dark, like they remembered that name too. Dalka. He didn't speak a word on the ride back. Neither did she. The mule carried them steady along the ridge, the sky darkening behind them. Elias gripped the reins with white knuckles, heart pounding in rhythms he hadn't felt since the war. Her whisper echoed in his head like a curse scratched into timber. Dalka. That name shouldn't exist anymore. It belonged to firelit nights, gutted bodies, and pine trees thick with smoke. He had buried it years ago. She rode behind him, arms slack around his waist. He felt her breath, slow and deliberate, like she was measuring each exhale. Elias kept scanning the tree line, half expecting movement. A flicker of guilt crept into his gut. He didn't know if he brought something cursed back with him, or if he was the curse that had returned. They reached the outskirt of Dry Hollow before dusk. A few townsfolk glanced up as Elias passed. He didn't meet their eyes. Sheriff Mullen tipped his hat but didn't speak. Even he knew better than to question Elias Boone when his jaw was set like iron. Inside his cabin, the old pine floor groaned under their boots. The fire hadn't been lit in days. Elias dropped his gear and nodded toward the cot. "Sit." She obeyed. No words, just eyes tracking everything in the room like an animal in foreign territory. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low. She hesitated. "Anka." "Anka Dalka?" She nodded once. The silence stretched. "I've heard that name before," he muttered, more to himself than her. "I know," she replied. His stomach twisted. She wasn't just some stranger who shared a cursed surname. She knew exactly who he was, and that made it worse. "What happened up there, Anka?" he said, pacing to the window. "In the Bitterroots. My crew. 10 men." Only I made it out." Her lips tightened. "You weren't supposed to survive." The words hit like a hammer. Elias turned, fists clenched. "Then why did I?" She looked away. "Because I begged them not to take you." Something in her tone, not fear but sorrow, made him pause. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth. He watched her, searching for signs, madness, deceit, guilt. But she just sat there, skin pale under the last traces of mud, her hands trembling. "Why now?" he asked. She looked up. "Because they're coming." Elias stepped back. "Who?" She didn't answer, just stared at the door like it might fly open at any moment. The wind howled outside. Somewhere far off an owl cried. But beneath that, if Elias strained hard enough, he could hear something else. A whisper in the pines. He suddenly realized this wasn't over. It had only just begun. Elias's cabin stood at the edge of a pinewood ridge, where the trees grew tall enough to blot out the stars, and the wind never stopped whispering. It was a place most men feared to go, let alone call home. But Elias had built it himself, stone by stone, timber by timber, after the war, after the mountains, after the nightmares. Now he wasn't alone. The woman he brought in, Anka, stood motionless near the hearth. He had helped her wash, the mud now gone, revealing high cheekbones, weathered skin, and a long scar along her collarbone. She looked no older than 30, but her eyes held centuries. And still she hadn't told him much. "You hungry?" Elias asked, tossing dried meat into a pan over the fire. She didn't answer, but when he slid the plate her way, she took it in silence. He watched her eat, measured, cautious, like every bite might betray her. The cabin creaked. The wind outside shifted. Elias's dog, a one-eyed mutt named Ridge, growled low from under the table. Anka flinched. "Are you all right?" Elias asked. Her fork paused. "They don't like dogs." He frowned. "Who doesn't?" She didn't respond. That night, as she slept curled beneath wool blankets on the cot, Elias sat by the fire sharpening his axe. His mind churned. Why her? Why now? He hadn't spoken the name Dalka in over a decade, and yet it found him again, like it had been hunting him this whole time. A low knock startled him. He froze. It came again, 3 taps, slow and deliberate. He grabbed the axe and opened the door. Nothing, just darkness and the hiss of wind through pine needles. He stepped outside, boots crunching frost. The moon was high, the forest was still. Then he saw it. Just beyond the edge of his clearing, hanging from a branch, was a rabbit, gutted, skinned, and strung upside down. No blood, not a drop on the snow. He cut it down and tossed it into the fire without a word. When he turned, Anka was standing at the doorway. "They found me," she whispered. Elias stared. "Who?" "They followed the scent." "You're not making sense." She looked past him into the trees. "You brought me here. That means they'll come for you too." The flames cracked louder, brighter. Ridge barked once and backed into the shadows. "I ain't afraid of ghosts," Elias muttered. "They're not ghosts," she said, and with that she walked back to the cot and lay down without another word. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat near the window, axe in hand, watching the tree line. The forest wasn't empty, and something out there knew his name. By morning, the forest was silent again, too silent. Elias brewed coffee while Anka sat cross-legged by the fire, staring into it like she saw things beyond the flame. He watched her hands, calloused, steady. She wasn't frail. She was trained. "Start talking," he said finally. "What are they?" Anka didn't blink. "They're called the Hollowborn. Not beasts, not men. They come from deep woods, old woods, where nothing has walked for 100 years. Elias raised a brow. "You mean to tell me this is some backwoods ghost story?" "No," she said calmly. "They're real. I was raised among them." His grip tightened on the tin mug. "Raised. They used me as bait. I was part of a traveling show once. Folk paid to see the forest witch. But that was just the cover. The show went from town to town, always near tree lines, always just before something bad happened. She glanced up at him. Fires, missing children, people found drained. Elias felt a chill snake down his back. So you ran? I escaped, she said. They don't let people go, Elias, but I knew if I reached the right woods I could hide, until now. He stood, pacing slowly. Why me? Why bring that name into my life again? Because you've seen them before, she said, whether you admit it or not. His thoughts reeled back to the Bitterroot Mountains, 10 men dead, their eyes wide, their blood frozen in the snow. Bodies too light for the wounds they bore, and something in the trees, something that watched. He had buried it, but it had never left him. You said they don't like dogs, he muttered, glancing at Ridge. The mutt was curled by the door, ears flat, still growling under his breath. Anchor nodded. Dogs see them, sometimes before they even come. Why now? He asked. Why after all these years? She leaned forward. Because they've tracked me across the country, forest to forest, river to ridge, and they've marked you too. Elias exhaled hard. What do they want? Her eyes didn't flinch. To feed. Outside, the wind shifted again. A creak echoed from the porch. Elias grabbed his axe and opened the door. Snow blanketed the ground. But just beyond the cabin, leading toward the tree line, was a trail of rabbits, skinned, bloodless, perfectly spaced like offerings. Anchor stepped beside him. It's a warning. He looked at her. No, it's an invitation. She didn't argue. He slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt and moved to stoke the fire. You know how to stop them? He asked. Only if you're willing to believe things you wish weren't true. Elias stared at the flames. He already believed. The snow deepened that week, blanketing the pines in a silence that didn't feel right. The wind hissed through the trees like it carried secrets from a world no man should know. Anchor spent her days etching strange symbols into the cabin walls with charcoal, circles, eyes. Roots that spiraled like veins. Elias watched, uncertain whether to help or burn the place down. These are protections, she explained one morning, tracing a jagged mark above the window. They fear old signs, from before language. He didn't argue. Instead, he fetched his rifle, sharpened his axe, and boarded the outer walls tighter, but the unease in his gut only grew. That evening, Elias rode into town. He needed answers, real ones. The saloon was half empty. Men glanced his way and quickly looked down. No one wanted to talk to Elias Boone when he looked like that. He found the priest, Father Mallory, sitting near the stove at the back of the church. Elias didn't waste time. You ever hear the name Dalka? The priest's face paled. He crossed himself before speaking. Where did you hear that? Elias didn't reply. Mallory leaned forward. Dalkas a bloodline from the old country, not just Romani, not just wanderers, something darker. Their women could speak to trees. Their men hunted shadows. Wherever they went, death followed. Elias stared. The church tried to burn them out 100 years ago, Mallory added. Didn't work. What are they? Elias asked. Mallory hesitated. They serve something old, something that lives where light doesn't reach. I don't know its name. I just know people disappear when the Dalka are near. Elias left without another word. By the time he returned to the cabin, the moon was rising, a bloated red thing. Anchor was waiting on the porch, arms folded, face tight. They've begun circling, she said. He followed her gaze. In the snow just beyond the clearing were tracks, deep, uneven, but not human, and not any beast Elias had ever seen. That night, they worked together. Elias gathered dried sage from the back room, left over from a trapper who swore by it. Anchor burned it and walked the perimeter, chanting in a language Elias didn't recognize. They carved runes into the door, salted the windows, tied bundles of thorn and bone above the chimney. You're taking this awful seriously for a lumberjack, she said. He didn't smile. I saw one of those things once, years back. It didn't bleed right. Anchor met his eyes. Then you understand. Near midnight, Ridge began barking, wild, panicked. Elias ran to the window. The trees were moving. not from wind, but from something stepping through them. Then a claw, long curved and grey as dead bark, raked across the cabin wall. Elias didn't speak. He just picked up his axe. The cabin shuddered as the claw dragged again across the wall, long, deliberate, like it was marking the place. Elias stepped back from the window, axe in hand, while Ridge snarled at the door, his fur bristling like pine needles in a lightning storm. "Stay behind me," Elias said. Anka didn't move. Her eyes glowed with a strange intensity, like she'd already seen this night 100 times in her mind. Then came the sound, low, hollow breathing. Not human, not animal, just wrong. It seeped through the cracks in the wall like cold air. Suddenly, a shutter exploded inward. Elias lunged, driving the axe straight into a reaching arm, if it could be called that. It felt like wet bark and bone. The creature let out a screech that made the walls tremble and recoiled into the dark. Anka was already scattering ash across the threshold, chanting under her breath. The words had weight. The fire swelled unnaturally, casting tall shadows across the log walls. Elias yanked the axe free, bloodless but coated in black sap that sizzled where it touched the floor. Another thud hit the roof. "They're testing us," Anka muttered. "How many?" She didn't answer. The door shook under impact, then again, stronger. Elias braced it with a beam, breathing hard. Ridge barked wildly, then whimpered, backing away. One of them dropped from the roof, crashing against the side wall, its face smeared against the glass, white eyes, hollow sockets, jaws that opened too wide, like a snake unhinging. Elias grabbed a jar of lamp oil, lit the wick and threw it through the window. Flames burst up, catching the creature's arm and part of the pine siding. It shrieked and vanished into the snow, trailing embers. More followed. The air outside swirled with movement, bodies darting between trees just beyond the firelight. Elias's hands bled from splinters, from the axe, from nothing he could remember doing. He didn't stop. They came again, slamming into the walls from all sides. Then, in the chaos, one voice rang out, deep, guttural, and unmistakable. "Elias!" He froze. The voice didn't come from Anka. It came from the darkness outside. "I remember you," it hissed. "You smelled like pine and blood." Elias's heart thudded in his chest. He had heard that voice once before, in the bitter roots, when he ran half dead from the trees, leaving his crew behind. "You should have died," it said. Anka gripped his arm. They never forget. He stared at the flames, the markings, the eyes outside. For the first time in years, Elias didn't question anymore. He believed. Anka stepped forward, her voice steadier than he'd ever heard it. "You want him?" she shouted into the woods. "You'll have to get through me." Her hands lifted and the fire behind her roared. The fire pulsed behind Anka like a living thing, casting her shadow tall against the cabin wall. Outside, the creatures hissed, circling, but none approached again. Not yet. Elias lowered his axe slightly. "What the hell was that?" She turned to him slowly. "My blood remembers." "What does that mean?" Anka exhaled. "The Hollowborn don't just hunt the living. They were created from a pact, an ancient one. My family bound themselves to it long ago, traded safety for power. My ancestors fed the woods. In return, they controlled the darkness that lived there." Elias felt his throat tighten. "And you?" "I was the one who tried to break it." She walked to the window, her reflection flickering in the firelight. "I left. That night in the Bitterroots, I was supposed to lure your crew into the heart of their hunting ground. But when I saw you, something changed. I warned you. That's why you got out." Elias stared. "You were there. I was the girl you saw, running through the snow. The one you thought was a hallucination." He remembered it now, half frozen, lungs burning, chasing a figure he thought might lead to safety. And then waking days later, alone by the riverbank. "You saved me," he whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the table and opened a leather pouch. Inside were herbs, small bones, and a strip of faded parchment inked in red. "There's a ritual," she said. "A blood pact to counter the old one. It won't destroy them, but it'll bind them again. Keep them away from this place." "What's the cost?" Elias asked, knowing the answer before she said it. "Blood. Mine. Yours." He hesitated. "And if we don't do it, they'll never stop. Not until they've torn every memory of us from the earth." Elias looked down at his hands, the scars, the dirt beneath his nails, the blood already drying from tonight's fight. He thought of the men he'd buried in his past, thought of Ridge, still growling from the corner, thought of her standing there offering him a way forward that looked more like a cliff edge. "Tell me what to do." Anka's eyes softened. "We draw the circle under moonlight, mix ash and iron. We each cut our palms and speak the vow." He nodded. All night they prepared. Burned sage, crushed berries, gathered bones from the rabbit, remains left by the creatures. Elias drew the circle while Anka whispered the words. Together they stood within it, hands clasped, blood dripping into the earth. As they spoke the vow, Elias felt something shift, a presence awakening deep beneath the snow, listening, their blood soaked into the soil, binding them to each other and to the coming storm. The morning after the ritual broke with silence, so thick it felt unnatural. The woods had gone mute, no birdsong, no wind, not even the creak of branches. It was like the world was holding its breath. Anka stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the horizon. The binding wasn't enough. They've pulled back, but only to prepare. Elias joined her. "Then what's next?" She pointed toward the south. "Widow's Hollow. That's where it began. That's where it must end." He didn't ask how she knew. Some things don't come from memory, they come from blood. They packed light, sage, salt, blades, oil, and the last of the firewood wrapped in canvas. Ridge followed, silent but alert, as if he too knew where they were going. The trail led them through dense thickets and steep ridges. Snow deepened by the hour, swallowing their tracks behind them. Widow's Hollow wasn't marked on any map, but Anka moved with certainty, guiding them between broken trunks and frozen creeks, like the land itself remembered her. By dusk, they reached the rim of the hollow. It opened like a wound in the forest, black, wide and sunken, ringed by gnarled trees that bent inward. Nothing grew inside. No sound crossed its edge. Elias felt a pressure behind his eyes, like something pushing back from within the void. He looked down and saw bones, old ones, deer, foxes, wolves, and human. Anka stepped into the hollow without hesitation. He followed. The air inside was heavy, wet, full of decay and memory. The snow here didn't crunch. It sighed, like it had been waiting. "This is where the Dalka made the first vow," Anka said. "Where they called it forth." "What is it?" Her voice trembled. "The Hollowborn have no name for it, only hunger. It feeds on fear, grief, guilt. It remembers every face." Elias swallowed hard. "Then it knows mine." They reached the center, a flat stone altar wrapped in vines that pulsed faintly. Anka opened her pouch and began to prepare the final rite. Elias gathered dry wood and formed a ring, lighting small flames at each cardinal point. As the last fire lit, the wind howled, not above, below. The earth groaned. Shadows moved between the trees, not fast, not in attack, but circling, watching, forming a ring of their own. Elias gripped his axe tighter. Suddenly the faces of his old crew flickered before him in the smoke. Men he knew, men who died screaming. They didn't speak. They just stared. "I see them," he whispered. "They're not real," Anka said, voice taut. "They're echoes." But one of them stepped forward. "Boone," the ghost rasped, "why'd you leave us?" Elias staggered. "No, don't listen," Anka shouted. "They want you to break." His hands shook, but the ritual wasn't over, not yet. The fire sputtered as ash began to spiral upward, drawn into a vortex over the altar. Anka stood at its center, arms outstretched, her voice rising in that ancient tongue, words that scratched at Elias's ears, as if they weren't meant for humans. The creatures closed in. Dozens now. They formed a circle at the edge of the hollow, tall and gaunt, with limbs too long and faces that never stopped shifting. They didn't cross the ring of flame. Not yet. Elias fought to steady his breath, axe in hand, watching shadows flicker behind the veil of fire. One of the Hollowborn stepped forward, its eyes bright like lanterns, its mouth stretched into a cruel grin. "You," it said. "Always running, always surviving what should have killed you." Elias stepped between it and Anchor. "You picked the wrong man." The creature laughed, a sound like teeth grinding on stone. "You carry the guilt of 10 men. Let it bury you." Then it lunged. Elias met it mid-stride, the axe splitting the air. Metal met flesh or something close to it, and the creature shrieked, recoiling as black smoke poured from the wound. Another came from the side. Elias turned, swung wide, caught its leg, and sent it crashing into a tree. The flames weakened. "Keep chanting," Elias shouted. But Anchor was trembling. Her voice cracked. Blood dripped from her palms into the stone. Her eyes rolled back. "They're trying to silence me," she gasped. "They know the end is near." Another creature leapt, crashing past Elias and onto the altar. It struck her across the shoulder, sending her sprawling. Elias roared and hurled his axe, catching the beast in the neck. It gurgled, then burst into ash. He rushed to her side. "You still with me?" he asked. Anchor coughed. "The last line. I need to speak it inside the hollow. The real hollow." Elias looked around. "This is it." She shook her head weakly. "No. Beneath." A tremor split the ground. The altar cracked down the center, revealing a narrow pit below, swirling with smoke and roots that pulsed with faint red light. "You jump, you don't come back," Elias muttered. Anchor looked at him. "One of us has to." Another creature roared. Without another word, Elias lifted her, held her gaze, and stepped back toward the altar's edge. "I owe you a life," he said. "Now I pay it." "No!" He pushed her aside and leapt. The pit swallowed him in silence. Anchor screamed his name, but it was lost to the storm rising above the hollow. All around her the creatures froze. One by one they turned toward the altar, heads tilting, sensing something change. Then the wind died. The fires flared white, and everything went still. The light faded. When Elias opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor. Snow fell gently around him, undisturbed. No fire, no altar, no hollow, just stillness. He sat up, pain lancing through his ribs. The axe was gone, his coat torn. But he was alive. There was no sign of Anchor. He stood slowly, surveying the clearing. The forest had changed, cleaner, clearer, as if the weight that had hung over it for generations had finally lifted. The trees no longer leaned inward. The wind no longer whispered in tongues. Where the altar once stood, he found a pendant, her pendant. He knelt, fingers brushing the cold metal. A small charm shaped like an eye, etched with the same markings she had carved into his cabin walls. Tied around it was a strip of birch bark, carved carefully with a blade. "You jumped so I wouldn't have to. I took your place below to keep the seal. You are free now. Tell them we can end it." "Anchor." He swallowed hard, eyes burning. She had stayed behind to hold the boundary, alone. Elias returned to Dry Hollow days later, ragged and silent. The townsfolk barely recognized him. He rebuilt the cabin from the ashes, kept the runes etched deep in the timber, and burned sage every full moon. He didn't speak of what happened, not at first. But over time, when strangers came asking about the woods, about the stories of whispers and lost travelers, Elias told them, not all of it, but enough. He said her name. He made sure it wouldn't be forgotten. The creatures never returned. Ridge kept watch from the porch, older but ever vigilant. And though the night sometimes brought dreams, visions of red roots and open mouths, Elias no longer feared sleep. One evening, a boy from town asked him if monsters were real. Elias looked at the trees, then back to the boy. They were. He left the rest unsaid. Years passed. The forest grew back. The old trails disappeared. But the legend remained, of the lumberjack who faced what no man should, and the woman with the covered face who whispered a name older than the hills, Dalka. And if you followed every step of this tale, every claw mark, every shadow, every breath caught in the dark, then you know the power of stories that live in silence, so if this one stirred something in you, hit that subscribe button now. Join us for the next story that waits just beyond the firelight. And don't stop here. Click the video on your screen to discover what came after, or what might still be waiting beneath the snow.